I knew the second trench would come. I knew because I had already seen it. Not in sleep, not in a vision stitched from someone else's dying breath, but sitting upright in my office chair with coffee going cold in my hand. Sometimes the wall color shifted, white to pale gray and back. I could not measure whether it was my eyes or something else. So I stopped measuring. Measurement, after all, was what had brought us to the first trench. I was learning, slowly, to distrust the appetite for data. Ashvin's team called the new site Site B. No one had the energy for creative names. The file read, Southwestern Pacific, near an island chain where fishing boats had been vanishing at a rate the local Coast Guard blamed on weather and the insurers blamed on fraud. Gravity surveys of the area showed the same signature. Readings that refused to sit still, numbers sliding away from each other like oil on water. Smaller than our trench. Younger, if a thing like that could have an age. But growing. The briefing landed on my desk wrapped in the usual layers. Classification stamps, distribution codes, a cover memo from an admiral I had never met who used language borrowed from my own sanitized report. Nonlinear mass capture. Persistent drift. Recommended exclusion perimeter. My words had become furniture. People arranged them in rooms without knowing what they held up. I read through the supporting data twice. Fishing boats first. Small wooden craft that carried families out to grounds their grandparents had used. 5 in 18 months, far above the baseline. Then the coastal patrol vessel, a steel-hulled cutter sent to investigate the disappearances. It had reported unusual currents, requested permission to withdraw, received approval, and then failed to reach port. The search turned up an oil slick and a single life vest. The investigation concluded that a rogue wave had capsized the vessel. The investigator had never been to the location. He worked from a desk in a capital city and based his assessment on statistical probability. After the cutter, a research catamaran from a regional university. It had been mapping coral die-off patterns and drifted into the area following a current that its instruments said should not have existed. The crew of 4 sent confused messages about water temperature dropping despite their readings showing it climbing. Their last transmission described the sea surface dipping ahead of them like a bowl forming in real time. Then silence. The catamaran washed up on a reef 3 weeks later. Intact, clean, empty. That pattern should have been enough. It was the same script the first trench had run for centuries. Take the small ones first, the ones whose loss can be explained away, whose families do not have lawyers or admirals on speed dial. Build the collection quietly. Let the insurance reports and weather logs provide cover. By the time anyone with resources notices, the column is already established, and the question changes from, is something there, to, how big has it grown? The gravity data confirmed it. Ashvin's team had obtained records from 3 separate survey campaigns conducted over the past decade. Each had mapped the area for different clients. Mining, telecoms cable routing, seabed resource assessment. Each had produced readings that agreed everywhere except in one patch roughly 6 kilometers wide. Inside that patch, the numbers scattered. Not randomly, but with that specific quality of drift we had learned to recognize. Every pass generated values that leaned away from the previous pass, as if the mass beneath the ocean floor was rearranging itself between measurements. Surveyors had flagged it as instrument error, noted it, moved on. Their clients cared about cable routes and mineral deposits, not about a patch of ocean that could not decide how much it weighed. Tally brought the operational brief separately. He sat across from me and placed a tablet on the desk, screen facing up. They want to send a probe first. Unmanned. Then a crewed follow-up within 6 months if the probe survives. Who commands the crewed mission? Commander Liang. Chinese Navy. Seconded through the Joint Protocol. Young. Sharp record. Submarine service. 2 deep deployments. Commendations for calm under equipment failure. No anomaly experience because nobody has anomaly experience except us and the people we lost. And they want me to advise. They want you to bless it. He leaned back. Same game as last time, Captain. Your name on the letterhead, your reputation in the room. If it works, they built on your legacy. If it fails, you approved the plan. I turned the tablet over in my hands. The mission profile was cleaner than ours had been. Better sensors. A hull designed from the start for anomaly proximity, not retrofitted from a hybrid. Escape protocols written by people who had read my after-action report, or at least the version I had allowed them to read. They had even included a section on what they called identity displacement events, clinical language for what happened when the well reached into a person and replaced them with someone from another hull, another century, another line of history that may never have run through our world at all. The section ran to 14 pages. It included decision trees, escalation criteria, sedation protocols, and a flow chart for determining whether a displaced individual retained enough operational awareness to remain at their station. Someone had put serious thought into it. That scared me more than carelessness would have. They think they can plan for it, I said. They think checklists help. Checklists do help. Until they don't. I set the tablet down and looked at the wall behind Tally. It stayed white. It stayed plaster. It stayed a wall. For now. Who built the displacement protocol? I asked. A joint psych team. 3 military psychologists, 2 civilian researchers from a university program that officially studies deep-sea cognitive effects but actually works on our data. And 1 consultant you'll recognize. Who? Chemistry. The name took a moment to settle. Chem, the young mechanic who had stood in our engine room and screamed about depth charges and Second World War battle drill. The man who woke up knowing how to check feed lines on boilers he had never touched. He had gone into weapons development after the mission. Now, apparently, he had moved into the advisory circuit. He volunteered, Tally added. Said he understood the experience from the inside. The psych team uses him as a validator. He reads their protocols and tells them which parts would actually work when someone's hands are moving on their own. Does he still have the old memories? All of them. He told me once that he can close his eyes and walk through that destroyer deck by deck. He knows where every valve sits, where the hull was weakest, where the captain kept his log. He said it's like having a house next door that he doesn't live in but can visit any time. I thought about Chem visiting that house. About what it meant to carry another life inside your own, not as a dream or a fading trauma but as a parallel residence. The well had given him that. Free of charge, without asking permission, the way a landlord installs a tenant in a building they've already decided to condemn. And he thinks the protocol will help Liang's crew, I said. He thinks it'll help them survive the first encounter. After that, he says it depends on whether the well decides to be creative. I approved the probe mission. That part was easy. Machines do not carry identities the well can swap. Machines do not panic, do not open airlocks because they believe they are drowning on a wooden deck, do not tattoo symbols from navies that never formed. A probe would go down, circle, record, and either come back or not. Clean. It came back. Most of it. The probe was a deep-rated autonomous unit, cylindrical, armored, carrying a sensor package worth more than the fishing boats the area had already consumed. It launched from a support ship and descended along a pre-programmed spiral, scanning as it went. Surface telemetry stayed strong for the first 2 hours. Depth readings climbed normally. Temperature, salinity, current, all within expected ranges for the region. At 4,000 meters, the telemetry developed a stutter. Small data gaps, each lasting a fraction of a second. The support ship's operators attributed it to signal attenuation, standard at that depth. They switched to a higher gain relay and the feed stabilized. At 5,200 meters, the probe entered the target zone. Gravity readings began to slide. The first few passes looked like calibration drift, tiny deviations that any engineer would dismiss. But by the 5th pass, the pattern was unmistakable. Each sweep returned values that disagreed with the sweep before it and the sweep after it. The mass beneath the probe refused to hold still. The probe continued its spiral, tightening toward the center of the zone. At 6,000 meters, sonar returns changed. Hard contacts began to appear. The probe's autonomous navigation adjusted course to avoid them, threading through what its algorithm classified as geological formations. They were not geological formations. Camera feeds, when the probe was close enough for its lights to reach, showed hulls. Fishing boats first, their wooden frames split and darkened, nets trailing like hair. The coastal patrol cutter sat at an angle, its radar mast snapped, its hull creased as if something had pressed it from both sides. The research catamaran hung nearby, intact but turned so its bow pointed inward toward a central axis the cameras could not resolve. Deeper in, behind the known wrecks, shapes that did not match any vessel in the regional loss records. A long wooden hull that could have been a trading junk from another century. A steel submarine with markings in a language the analysis team could not place. A vessel made of materials the cameras struggled to render. Surfaces that seemed to absorb light and reflect it at the wrong angle, as if the hull existed at a slight disagreement with the water around it. All of them pointed inward. All of them twisted slowly in a current that flowed toward the center of the formation and did not come out the other side. The data package arrived on my desk in fragments. Some files carried timestamps from before the probe launched. Others were dated years ahead, referencing analysis software that had not been written yet. Ashvin's team spent weeks sorting the mess into something sequential. When they finished, the picture confirmed what we already feared. Site B was real and active, and it had been collecting for longer than the fishing boat losses suggested. The unknown vessels at the center might have been there for decades. Or centuries. Or they might have arrived from timelines where they had been built and sailed and lost without ever existing in our history. The well did not distinguish between the two. But there was something new. The probe's cameras had caught, in one brief pass near the outermost wrecks, a flash of light from deep within the forming column. Not bioluminescence. Not reflected instrument beams. A steady pale glow, like a lamp behind frosted glass, burning at the center of something that should have held only dark water and crushed metal. It pulsed. Not regularly. Not in a rhythm anyone could predict or correlate with tidal action, seismic activity, or any known cycle. It pulsed the way a thought might if thoughts could be watched from the outside. Brief, irregular, with long pauses that felt deliberate rather than random. Could be thermal, Ashvin told me over a secure line. His voice was thinner than I remembered. He lived inside data now, rarely surfacing for air or conversation. Volcanic activity beneath the trench floor might produce light through certain mineral reactions. Do you believe that? A pause. No. What do you believe? I believe that thing is awake in a way our trench wasn't when we first arrived. Or maybe ours was always awake and we were too busy being clever to notice. The glow isn't on any of the historical footage from our site. Either it develops over time, or it was hidden, or it wasn't there yet. Any of those answers is bad. How is it different from what we faced? Scale is smaller. The column is younger. But the temporal bleed in the probe data, the scrambled timestamps, the future-dated files, that's stronger than anything we saw at comparable distances. Our trench kept its tricks for when you were close. This one is reaching further out. The support ship reported compass anomalies during the probe's descent, and they were holding station 20 kilometers from the target zone. 20 kilometers. At our trench, we had to be within visual range of the column before instruments went unreliable. This one is broadcasting interference at 20 times that distance. Either it's fundamentally more powerful, or it's learned something. Learned from what? He went quiet for a moment. From the monitoring ring, Captain. The sensors we left at our trench. They've been transmitting data continuously for over a year. That data flows through relay buoys, satellite uplinks, processing centers on shore. If the well can affect communications, and we know it can, we experience that firsthand, then it's been touching our infrastructure for months. Maybe the data isn't only flowing out. Maybe something is flowing back along those connections. And maybe what our trench learns, the others learn too. I filed his assessment alongside mine. The committee reviewed both and scheduled the crewed mission for the following spring. Commander Liang flew in for a preparatory meeting. I met her in the same windowless room where an admiral had once laid maps in front of me and let silence do its work. This time I sat where the admiral had sat. Liang sat where I had been. The symmetry was not lost on me. History had folded neatly, placing me on the side of the table that sends people into the dark instead of the side that goes. She was compact and direct, with the particular calm of someone who had commanded in tight waters and come home each time with a clean log. She wore her uniform without vanity. Her file said she had commanded a fast attack submarine in the South China Sea, run training exercises in the Philippine Trench, and led a rescue operation when a research submersible had become tangled in deep cable. She had a reputation for economy. Few words, precise actions, no wasted movement. The Joint Protocol Committee had selected her from a field of 11 candidates. None of the others had her depth experience or her temperament. She read my report, the real one, not the public version, without expression. It took her 40 minutes. She did not skip sections. She did not ask questions during the reading. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me with eyes that had already begun to calculate. You cut sections of your own hull away with crew still inside. Yes. And you believe that was the correct decision. I believe it was the decision that got the rest of us out. Correct is a word for people who were not there. She absorbed that. I watched her process it the way an engineer processes a stress test result, not with emotion, but with assessment. Could she make that call? Would she have to? What would it cost? The identity displacement. Your report says you experienced it yourself. You saw versions of your own death. I saw versions of my own failure. The death was secondary. Did it change how you commanded? That was the question no one else had thought to ask. Or perhaps they had all thought it and been too polite or too frightened to say it aloud. In 12 months of debriefs, committee meetings, consultations, and quiet conversations in windowless rooms, no one had asked me whether watching myself die had changed the way I made decisions. They asked about the phenomenon. They asked about the crew. They asked about the gravity readings and the structural damage and the cost. They did not ask about the inside of my head. Liang did. I respected her for it. It made me distrust my own instincts, I told her. Every time I leaned toward a choice that felt natural, I had to ask whether the well had placed that instinct in me, whether the familiarity was mine or borrowed. I started choosing against my gut because my gut had died in too many other timelines. That's an ugly way to command. You lose speed. You second-guess everything. Men notice. And that worked. We're here. Some of us. I won't have your experience to draw on in the moment. Your report is useful, but reading about drowning and drowning are different things. They are. What would you tell me that isn't in the file? I thought about it. The room hummed with ventilation. Beyond the walls, clerks processed forms and officers walked corridors that led to other corridors, all of it orderly, all of it resting on a planet that had holes in its ocean where order went to be composted. Don't try to understand it, I said. You'll want to. Your science team will want to. Every scientist I've ever sailed with eventually leans too far over the railing. The well rewards curiosity the way a trap rewards hunger. Every answer it gives you is bait for a deeper question, and every deeper question pulls you closer. Observe from the farthest distance your mission allows. Record everything. Trust nothing the comms deliver unless you can verify it through a channel you physically control. And watch your crew's hands. Their hands. The displacement shows in the hands first. A person starts moving differently before they start speaking differently. Fingers reaching for controls that aren't there. Tying knots they never learned. Adjusting instruments by feel in a pattern that belongs to another age. If you see someone's hands change, that person is already gone. What you do next determines whether you lose one crew member or 10. The protocol says to isolate the affected individual and run a standard cognitive assessment. The protocol is fine for the first one, maybe the second. By the third, you won't have time for assessments. You'll be choosing who to sedate and who to keep at their station based on whether their borrowed skills are more useful than their original ones. That choice will feel practical. It will feel smart. Do not make it. Why not? Because that's how I lost my crew. Not in the explosion. Not when I cut the hull. I lost them when I started treating the displacements as resources instead of injuries. The well offers something useful, a piece of knowledge, a skill from another era, a doctrine from a future you haven't reached, and it looks like a gift. Use it once and you've told the well that you'll trade people for advantage. It will make that trade again and again, each time taking more and giving less. By the end, you won't know which crew members are yours and which are its. She wrote nothing down. Good. The things that matter most should live in the body, not on paper. Paper ends up in files, and files end up on desks, and desks sit in buildings that the well could reach through 20 kilometers of open water and a satellite uplink. One more question, she said. The message from the composite crew member. The one who was cut away in the forward section. Your report mentions it but doesn't include the content. No. Why? Because the content would change how you approach the mission. And I'm not sure the change would be in your favor. She studied me. You're deciding what I need to know. Yes. Isn't that what the Admiral did to you? Yes. And you resented it. Every day since. Then give me the message. I opened my desk drawer, took out a printed sheet, and slid it across the table. She read it once, quickly, then again slowly. Her expression did not change, but her hands went still on the table surface. Completely still, the way a person's hands go when their body is deciding between action and retreat and has not yet committed to either. "The columns are connected," she said quietly. "If the message is accurate. One structure with multiple points of contact. Not separate wells. Fingers. That's the claim. And watching is how it locates new sites. That's the claim." She slid the paper back. "You approved the monitoring ring. You approved continued observation. You read this message months ago, and you still signed off on the probe mission to Site B." "Yes." "Why?" "Because if I shut it down, someone else approves it. Someone who hasn't read this message and doesn't know what it means. At least with me in the chain, there's a chance the mission design is cautious enough to bring people back. If I step away, the next version of this operation will be run by optimists. Or you're the thread it's using to find us." The words landed in the room and sat there. She had arrived at the same conclusion the message implied, faster than I had. That was either a sign of sharp thinking or a sign that the idea was designed to be arrived at, a trap disguised as insight. "That possibility keeps me up at night," I told her. "It should." She stood. We shook hands. Her grip was steady. She walked out without looking back. I sat in the room for a long time after she left, watching the place where her hands had gone still. The crewed mission to Site B launched on schedule. I was not aboard. I watched from my office through a data feed that arrived with a 4-hour delay, enough lag that anything I saw had already happened, and anything I might have said would arrive too late to matter. That was the point. They wanted my name on the approval chain, not my voice on the command circuit. I was the old captain in the frame above the mantle, present in spirit, absent in consequence. Liang ran a clean approach. Her boat held at the outer monitoring perimeter, 25 kilometers from the estimated column center, 5 kilometers further out than her orders required. She had added the margin herself. I approved it from my desk with a single-word reply. Wise. They deployed drones first. Autonomous units, smaller and more numerous than the ones we had used. They fanned out in a search pattern that the future doctrine section of the protocol called a distributed sensing web. Each unit carried a gravity sensor, a camera, a sonar package, and a limited communication relay. They were designed to be expendable. If the well took one, the others would note its loss and adjust coverage. Center was clearly visible, a pale luminescence that shifted between blue and white and occasionally a color the cameras could not properly render, a flicker at the edge of the visual spectrum that registered as a smear on the recording. Liang's science team, 3 oceanographers, a geophysicist, and a data analyst named Reeves who had trained under Ushvin, processed the feeds in real time. Their reports arrived on my desk with notes and annotations that showed careful, methodical work. Mass readings inside the target zone drifted as expected. Water flowed inward with no measurable outflow. The column's structural composition matched our trench, oldest vessels at the center, newest at the periphery, all bows pointed inward, all slowly rotating. The unknown vessels were there too. The junk, the unidentified submarine, the ship made of wrong materials. In higher resolution, Reeves noted that the strange vessel's hull appeared to be layered, not welded or riveted but grown, as if it had been built by a process more biological than industrial. Its surface carried patterns that might have been text or might have been grain, like wood, but in metal. He flagged it for further study and moved on. Good discipline. Do not stare at the thing that wants to be stared at. For the first 3 days, no displacement events occurred. The crew functioned normally. Sensors collected data. Ushvin's remote team processed it in near real time. The well seemed docile, a curiosity rather than a threat. Reports from the boat carried a tone I recognized. the cautious optimism of people who had prepared for the worst and found something merely strange. I had felt it too, in those first hours above our own trench, when the numbers were only slightly wrong and the wrecks were just shapes on sonar, and the idea that the ocean could reach into a man's skull and replace him had seemed like briefing room paranoia. On the fourth day, communications began to fragment. Liang's scheduled check-in arrived 17 minutes early according to the timestamp, but 40 minutes late according to our clock. The content was routine, status normal, data collection proceeding, no anomalies beyond the expected gravitational drift. The next check-in arrived twice. Identical timestamps. Different wording. In one version, she reported calm seas and clean data. In the other, she mentioned a minor identity event in the engine room. A technician who had frozen at his station for 90 seconds, spoken 3 sentences in an unidentified language, then resumed his duties with no memory of the interruption. I flagged both to the operations center. They verified the encryption seals. Both were genuine. Both had been sent from the same boat at the same time by the same officer. The operations team logged the calmer version as primary and noted the other as a possible transmission artifact. I knew what it meant, but I also knew that telling them would change nothing. They had procedures for communication anomalies. The procedures did not include the possibility that the anomaly was the message itself. On the 5th day, displacement events began in earnest. Liang's reports, now arriving in triplicate with conflicting details, described 4 incidents in rapid succession. The engine room technician again, this time fully displaced, speaking fluent Portuguese in a dialect that linguistic analysis dated to the early 19th century. He described his ship, a trading brig caught in a sudden downward current near an island that matched no charted location. He lasted 40 minutes before the original personality reasserted itself. The technician remembered nothing but could now tie knots associated with age-of-sail rigging. A sonar operator, much like Tally, dropped into the perspective of a crew member aboard the coastal patrol cutter, the one that had disappeared 6 months earlier. She described the cutter's last hours in clinical detail, instruments failing, the crew's growing confusion, the captain's decision to press forward despite every warning, the moment when the water ahead of them seemed to open and the sea poured inward and took the ship with it. She wept as she spoke, in someone else's grief, then snapped back to herself and asked why everyone was staring. A marine biologist from the science team went rigid while examining probe data and began to narrate, in flat monotone English, the operational log of a vessel she identified as Survey Platform 9. The designation matched nothing in any Navy's records. She described instruments capable of measuring what she called mass coherence, and a crew that wore no national insignia. She spoke of the glow at the column center as a known phenomenon, catalogued and classified, something her version of the world had been studying for generations. She used terms that had no meaning in our physics but carried an internal consistency that made Ushvin's team take very careful notes. The 4th event was different. A young rating, barely 20, stepped into a corridor, stopped, looked at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time, and said clearly, in the voice of an old man, "Captain Vogel will approve the mission. He always does." Then he walked to his bunk and fell asleep. When he woke, he was himself. He did not remember speaking. The audio record captured the words perfectly. Liang included them in her report without comment. I read them at my desk 4 hours after they were spoken and felt the salt and rust taste rise in the back of my throat. Chem's protocol held through those early events. The affected crew members were isolated, assessed, returned to duty or kept under observation depending on the severity. The displaced personalities did not persist. The borrowed skills remained, always the skills, the little gifts the well left behind like coins on a bedside table. Liang ran her boat with steady hands. She did not use the composite knowledge. She did not integrate the displaced skills into operations. She followed the advice I had given her and treated every displacement as an injury, not an asset. I was proud of her for that. I was also afraid, because the well had not yet begun to push. On the 6th day, it pushed. The gravity readings spiked. Not the gradual drift we had come to expect, but a sudden, violent surge that threw Ushvin's graphs off scale. The inward water flow around the column accelerated. Drones on the periphery reported being pulled inward despite their thrusters running at maximum. 3 were lost in minutes, their feeds cutting out one by one as they tumbled into the wreck mass. The column itself seemed to shift, the entire structure of twisted hulls rotating faster, the glow at the center brightening until the cameras had to adjust their exposure. Liang ordered immediate withdrawal. Engines to full. Course away from the column. All personnel to secure stations. The boat responded, accelerating, the hull vibrating with the effort of fighting a current that had not existed 5 minutes earlier. Then the comms split open. Messages flooded the boat's receivers. Some came from the support ship on the surface, ordering continued data collection. Some came from a naval command that identified itself with codes Liang did not recognize. Some came from what appeared to be the boat itself, time-stamped hours in the future, describing events that had not happened yet. One message, stamped 3 days ahead, was addressed to me. Captain Vogel. Site B has merged with Site A. The monitoring ring at the original trench has gone dark. 14 new sites confirmed active. The advisory committee has been dissolved. All personnel with direct anomaly exposure are being recalled for containment. Do not resist recall. This is not a warning. It is a record. Liang ignored all of it. She maintained course away from the column, drove her boat through water that pulled at them like thick mud, and refused to acknowledge any communication she could not verify through direct visual contact with the surface ship. That discipline saved them. They cleared the influence zone after 3 hours of sustained thrust. The current weakened gradually, then dropped away as if a hand had released them. The column shrank on sonar behind them. The glow faded. Gravity readings returned to normal. The boat surfaced 8 hours later, intact, crew accounted for. 4 displacement events had occurred during the withdrawal. All 4 crew members had recovered. None had been permanently displaced. Liang's refusal to engage with the well, to use its offerings, to follow its communications, to let curiosity or fear pull her closer, had worked. She had proven that it was possible to approach a well, observe it, and leave with your crew still wearing their own faces. She had also proven something else. When I read the full debrief, I noticed what she had not put in the summary. The young rating, the one who had spoken with an old man's voice and said my name, had experienced a second displacement during the withdrawal. This time he had described, in precise detail, the interior of my office. My desk. My chair. The folder in my drawer. The glass of water on my kitchen counter that I did not remember pouring. He described me sitting alone in a dark kitchen, watching the water for movement. That event had not happened yet. I had not yet sat in that kitchen in the dark. The rating described it on the 6th day of the mission. I read his account on the 8th day. I sat in my kitchen in the dark on the 12th day, after everything else had gone wrong, and I looked at the glass of water and I knew that I was living inside a moment someone had already seen from inside a trench 2,000 kilometers away. Liang's mission was classified as a qualified success. Data obtained. Crew returned. No permanent losses. The committee celebrated with the muted satisfaction of people who had budgeted for disaster and received only a scare. Reports were filed. Analyses begun. The probe data and the crewed mission data were combined into a comprehensive assessment of Site B that ran to 400 pages and occupied a team of 12 for 3 months. I read every page. I edited the language where it reached too far. I softened conclusions that would alarm without informing. I signed my name at the bottom of each section review. The report described the well as a persistent gravitational anomaly with associated electromagnetic and hydrodynamic effects. It noted the displacement events as transient neurological episodes potentially linked to infrasonic exposure in the deep environment. It recommended continued monitoring, expanded exclusion zones, and further study. It did not mention the message stamped 3 days ahead. It did not mention the rating who described my kitchen. It did not mention the glow that pulsed like thought. Those details went into a separate annex that was distributed to 7 people. I was one of them. Ashvin was another. The other 5 were the same mixture of military, intelligence, and insurance representatives who had first put me in a windowless room and asked me to front their circus. The annex was honest. It laid out the evidence for temporal bleed, for the well's ability to reach along probable futures, for the connection between monitoring infrastructure and the anomaly's apparent growth. It noted Ashvin's hypothesis that the wells were not separate entities but expressions of a single structure, and it cited the message from the composite crew member that described them as fingers of one hand. The annex recommended shutting down all monitoring equipment within 100 kilometers of any confirmed or suspected site. It recommended ceasing all gravity surveys in deep ocean trenches. It recommended that all personnel with direct anomaly exposure be evaluated for ongoing connection to the phenomenon and, if evidence of continued contact was found, be removed from any role involving anomaly-related decision-making. That last recommendation was aimed at me. I knew it. The committee knew it. We all sat in a room and looked at it on the screen and understood that the most careful, most evidence-based response to what we had learned was to stop looking and to remove the person who had been looking longest. The committee voted 4-3 against the annex recommendations. Monitoring would continue. Surveys would continue. I would remain in my advisory role. The deciding votes came from the insurers, who argued that the cost of ignorance exceeded the theoretical risk of observation. They had numbers. They had models. They had decades of lost data that they could finally explain if the wells were real and mappable and, ultimately, predictable. I voted with the minority, for whatever that was worth. The minority included Ashvin, an intelligence colonel who had been in the original briefing room, and myself. We were outvoted by people who believed in measurement. Months passed. The monitoring continued. New data arrived daily. The original trench grew. Site B grew. The 14 yellow markers on the global map, the suspected sites where gravity readings misbehaved, became 22. Survey teams were dispatched to 3 of them. 2 returned with confirmed column formations. 1 did not return at all. I continued to edit briefs, attend meetings, answer questions from officers who wanted to know the practical limits of anomaly exposure as if it were radiation, something with a dose curve and a threshold. I gave them numbers because numbers comforted them. I chose the numbers carefully, always conservative enough to sound cautious, never alarming enough to shut the program down. I walked the line I had always walked, between truth that paralyses and lies that enable. I told myself I was managing an unmanageable situation. I told myself that my presence in the chain was a moderating force, that without me the missions would be more aggressive, the approaches closer, the risks higher. I told myself these things in the daytime. At night, alone, I wondered whether I was the thread. The displacements had not stopped when we left the trench. They had simply become quieter. Not the dramatic full-body takeovers we had experienced aboard the boat. Something subtler. I would reach for a coffee mug and my hand would pause in the air for a fraction of a second, adjusting its grip as if the mug were a different shape. I would walk down a corridor and my feet would step over a threshold that was not there, a knee knocker in a hatch that existed on a different ship. I would begin a sentence in a meeting and hear, beneath my own words, the ghost of another phrasing, an older construction, a turn of speech from a man who had commanded a patrol submarine in a timeline where the trench had taken him. These episodes lasted moments. They left no evidence. If I had reported them, the committee would have activated the annex recommendation and removed me from my role. Someone else would sit at my desk. Someone without the context, without the caution, without the memory of what the well looked like from the inside. I weighed that risk against the risk of my own compromise. I chose to stay. I chose to watch myself for signs of deeper infiltration and to trust that I would recognize them when they came. That was my second wrong call. The first had been staying at the trench. The pattern held. I always chose presence over retreat, engagement over withdrawal, the illusion of control over the honesty of helplessness. The well knew this about me. Every version of me it had consumed had made the same choice. I was not outthinking it. I was running its favorite program. One evening, late, the base nearly empty, I sat in my office reviewing the latest gravity survey compilation. The 22 markers on the global map had become 31. Each showed the drift signature. Each sat along deep ocean trenches or abyssal plains where the Earth's crust was thin and the water was heavy and the distance from the surface was measured in kilometers of cold, dark pressure. A new report from Ashvin's team sat open on my screen. He had found something in the monitoring data that he described as recursive patterning. The gravity readings from the original trench, when plotted over time and filtered for the drift component, showed a structure. Not random variation. A repeating pattern, like a signal buried in noise. When he applied the same filter to Site B's data, the same pattern appeared. When he checked the two confirmed new sites, there it was again. The same pattern. The same signal. Broadcast from 4 separate locations on the ocean floor, synchronized to within fractions of a second despite the thousands of kilometers between them. The pattern, when translated into frequency, sat just below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound. The kind of vibration that travels through water and rock and steel and bone. The kind that does not announce itself but sits in the body and accumulates. Ashvin's report did not speculate about what the pattern meant. He was a careful man. He presented the data, noted the synchronization, flagged it for further analysis, and moved on. But in a personal note attached to the file, informal, unclassified, meant only for me, he wrote, "It's breathing, Captain. All of them at once. The same breath." My desk lamp flickered. The air in the room changed, a faint taste of salt and rust that did not belong to a climate-controlled building on solid ground. I looked at my hands. They were mine. Old, spotted, steady enough. The pen between my fingers was my pen. The desk was my desk. But the wall behind my monitor had shifted. Not the color this time. The texture. For a moment, less than a breath, it was not plaster and paint. It was steel. Riveted steel, old and sweating with condensation, curving inward like the hull of a ship I had once commanded in a life I had never lived. I could smell engine oil and salt water and the particular staleness of air that has been breathed by too many men in too small a space. I could hear the creak of a hull under pressure, the distant thrum of screws turning in heavy water. Then it was a wall again. Plaster. Paint. A framed certificate and a calendar showing a month I was fairly certain was the right one. I sat very still. I listened. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a cleaner pushed a cart. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The wall had not changed. I had changed. For a fraction of a moment, I had been somewhere else, someone else, standing inside a hull that was sliding toward a point of no return. The well had not reached through the water to find me. It had reached through me. Through the connection I had maintained by sitting at this desk, reading these reports, signing these forms, keeping the thread taut between the trench and the room where decisions were made. I opened the desk drawer and took out the handwritten file. The one with names the institution would never print on memorial plaques. Tally. Chemistry painter. Mills. Ashvin. Leong. The petty officer from the old cruiser. The composite crew members. The men and women I had cut away. The ones who never came back. The ones who came back wrong. The fishing boat crews. The patrol cutter. The rating who described my kitchen from inside a trench. At the bottom, below the last name, I wrote my own. Not because I was dead. Because I was no longer certain I was entirely here. The well did not need water to reach. It needed attention. It needed someone to keep watching, keep measuring, keep filing reports that drew lines from its fingers to the rooms where decisions were made. I had spent my career feeding it the one thing it truly ate. Not ships. Not bodies. Not time. Connection. Every sensor was a thread. Every report was a map. Every name on a briefing was an anchor point. And I, the quiet old captain who never talked to reporters, who smoothed relations and owned failures, I was the longest thread of all. They had brought me back for my name, and my name had become a rope that the well held at one end while I held the other, and neither of us was willing to let go. I closed the file. I turned off the lamp. I walked out of the office, down the corridor, past the memorial hall where new plaques gleamed under soft light. I stopped there. I read the names. Some were old, ships lost decades before my mission. Some were new vessels that had vanished in the months since our return. One plaque, freshly mounted, bore the name of the survey ship that had gone to one of the suspected sites and never come back. 12 crew. A small brass plate with their names in neat rows. Families had stood here. Flags had been folded. An admiral had spoken words about sacrifice and the sea's indifference. I reached out and touched the plate. The brass was cool, real, solid. The names were etched, permanent, true. These people had existed. They had walked aboard a ship. They had gone to a place on the ocean that I had marked on a map and approved for investigation. They had not come home. Their loss was on the file in my drawer, and it was on this wall, and it was somewhere in the column of a well that I had helped to feed. I walked through the gate and into the night air. The ocean was out there beyond the base perimeter, beyond the town, beyond the coast road with its sleeping houses. I could not see it. I could hear it. The slow rhythm of water on rock, patient and old and utterly without malice. It sounded patient. It sounded like something that had been breathing for a very long time and intended to keep breathing for longer than anything on the surface could measure. I drove home. The house was dark and small and exactly as I had left it that morning, which meant nothing anymore. Constancy had become suspicious. Walls that held their color, doors that opened onto the right rooms, clocks that agreed with each other. These were things I had once taken as the baseline of reality. Now they felt like a performance, a surface held taut over something that moved beneath it. I sat in the kitchen without turning on a light. The fridge hummed. A clock ticked. A neighbor's dog barked once and fell quiet. On the counter sat a glass of water I did not remember pouring. The surface was still. I watched it for a long time, waiting for it to move. A young man 2,000 kilometers away, inside a steel hull fighting its way out of a well's grip, had described this moment. He had seen it through my eyes, or through the eyes of whoever I would be when I reached this kitchen on this night. He had spoken it aloud on a submarine, and Liang had recorded it, and I had read the transcript, and now I was living it. The water did not move, but I no longer trusted stillness. Stillness was what the well wore on its surface while its fingers spread beneath the floor of the world, finding new trenches, new cracks, new places where the weight of things refused to settle. Stillness was the pause between one swallowed ship and the next. It was the breath between the pulse of that pale glow. It was the gap between one displacement and the next, between one version of me and the one that would follow. I left the water where it was. I went to bed. I did not dream, or if I did, the dreams wore the shape of ordinary life so perfectly that I could not tell them apart from waking. That, I suppose, was the point. In the morning, I would go back to my office. I would read the latest reports. I would edit the language, soften the warnings, sign my name at the bottom. The institution would send its surveys, build its sensors, plan its missions. The well would watch through the instruments we gave it, and I would sit at the center of the filing system, the old captain who kept everything in order, the thread that ran from the deepest trench to the quietest desk. Tally came by in the morning. He looked older now. Hair silver at the edges, his eyes still carrying that listening quality, as if Sonar never quite turned off. He sat across from me with a mug of something he did not drink and told me about the latest from Ashvin's team. They think they've identified another trench with a similar profile. Smaller. Early stage, maybe. Southern Indian Ocean, along the fracture zone. They want a mission. They always do. He watched the screen over my shoulder where the latest column feed hung. 31 markers on the map now. 31 points where the world's weight did not add up. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we'd walked away when the first kid started talking like an old sailor? He asked. All the time. Those ships were already there 10 years ago. A century ago. Longer. We didn't start it. No. We fed it. He sat with that for a moment. Then, "You'll be at the next briefing?" "Yes." "They'll ask if we can keep this contained. I'll tell them we can keep it watched." Containment is a story they tell themselves. It's the story that keeps the funding active. Without funding, they don't build exclusion zones. Without exclusion zones, civilian ships sail straight through. And with the monitoring, the thing grows faster. Yes. So either way. Either way. He gave a small nod and left. I listened to his footsteps down the corridor, steady and measured, the walk of a man who had learned to listen to surfaces for what moved beneath them. I turned back to the feed one more time. The probe at the original trench had completed another circuit. The column was larger again. New wrecks had joined since the last pass. Some bore names I recognized from fresh memorial plaques. Others had hull lines I had never seen, designs from futures or parallels or wherever the well drew its collection. One near the outer edge carried a half-finished flag. Paint crews had not completed the emblem before the ship went under. I recognized the outline of the symbol from the folder Lindholm had shown me months ago. It was the badge for the vessel they planned to name after me. They had not yet laid that keel in our shipyard. The funding package still sat in committee, tangled in procurement reviews and political negotiations. But there it was, already sliding inward on the well's own timeline. A boat from a near future, built on lessons drawn from my mission, following orders drafted in rooms I had sat in, crewed by men and women who would be recruited from training centers that were currently teaching them to serve on ships that had not yet failed. The well did not only feed on past mistakes. It reached along probable lines, taking what it wanted in advance, filing vessels in its column before their builders had finished reading the blueprints. I sat and watched the probe circle, sending back neat readings that would go into reports. Engineers would chart the growth. Insurers would adjust models. Admirals would nod and write plans. Somewhere, a young officer would read my after-action report and feel the same mixture of dread and ambition I had felt in that first windowless room. She would accept the mission. She would go down. She would see the column and the glow and the dead ships pointing inward. And she would make a choice, her own or one the well had prepared for her, and the cycle would continue. In a drawer beside me lay the unfinished briefing I had been asked to edit. It aimed to summarize the current state of knowledge for senior officials and selected civilian partners. I picked it up. I read through my own careful language, the measured phrases, the controlled vocabulary, the precise balance between alarm and reassurance. Nonlinear mass capture. Persistent drift. Recommended exclusion perimeter. Words designed to make the impossible administrative. I picked up a pen. For a long moment, I held it over the page. I could rewrite it. I could put everything in, the message from the composite, the synchronized breathing, the future-dated ship in the column, the glass of water on my counter. I could tell the truth and let the institution react however it would react. Panic or paralysis or, perhaps, the one slim chance that someone smarter than me would read it and find an answer I had missed. Or I could do what I had always done. Soften. Shape. Control the flow of information the way a captain controls a ship, not by eliminating the current but by angling into it, keeping enough way on to steer. I crossed out a few lines that hinted too strongly at temporal bleed and replaced them with phrases like anomalous chronological artifacts and sensor timestamp inconsistencies. I adjusted a paragraph about the glow to emphasize possible thermal explanations. I trimmed Ushvin's breathing hypothesis to a single footnote. Better to keep it inside the comfort zone of people who think in numbers and diagrams. That choice meant they would treat the well as a manageable hazard instead of as a hole in history. Once you start treating something like that, you design systems around it instead of trying to stamp it out. Systems spread. That is what they do. Systems become infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes dependence. Dependence becomes a thread the well can follow from the trench to the desk to the kitchen to the dark place behind your eyes where you keep the things you almost remember. When I finished the edits, I signed my name at the bottom. My hand did not tremble. I had long ago used up the energy for that kind of reaction. The signature looked the way it always had. The same loops, the same angles, the same name that had been pinned to an admiral's briefing and a hull plaque and a memorial list and a file in a drawer. They had brought me back for my name. That was still the only reason I gave people. It was still true enough. The ocean keeps its own records. We just help with the filing. And the filing never ends, because the well keeps adding pages. Ships and crews and captains and choices, all of them pressed flat and bound into a volume that grows from the center outward, a library written in gravity and salt and the steady, patient breath of something that learned long ago that the easiest way to eat a world is to let it document its own consumption. I closed the report. I turned off the display. I sat alone in a room full of familiar walls that might not match the ones I remembered. The ventilation hummed. The clock ticked. Somewhere beyond the building, beyond the base, beyond the coast, the ocean waited with the patience of a thing that has never needed to hurry. That was the end of my part in the story, not the end of the story itself. Stories end when the last person who carries them stops telling. The trench does not tell stories. It collects them. And as long as there is someone sitting at a desk, reading a report, signing a name, watching a screen, as long as someone is paying attention, the collection grows. The ocean keeps its own records. I just help with the filing.